Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on the last day of this amazing forum. My name is Sarah Nibbs. I'm the Deputy Regional Director of UN Women here in Asia Pacific, and I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's session. Before we start, I'd just like to let you know that interpretation is available at the bottom left of your screen. If you go to the white box that says floor, you can choose from 12 different languages. And we really want all of you to be able to fully enjoy the session. So please go there if you would like translation. We're going to have a very exciting panel for you today with some wonderful speakers. But before we hear from them, I want to see a little bit more about you. We'd like to have a look at who's joining us. So if you click on the session title, you'll see a button labeled Tasks, and then you can go to some poll questions. So please do that now, and we'll find out who's here. Some from Pacific. Not surprising, maybe we haven't got some from the other regions yet. It's a little bit of a strange time of day for them, a strange time of night, but okay, great. Welcome to all of you. And I think we have another poll question as well. So please do that one too. This one is to find out which sectors you work in. So it will be great if you can answer this one, because we really want to have, we know we're going to have a very rich discussion with lots of different colleagues and partners here. So if you can answer that one as well, it will be fantastic. And maybe I'll also take this moment to share one piece of housekeeping with you as well while you're doing that, which is just to let you know that if you have any questions, we really hope that you will, because we want to have a very interactive discussion. You can leave your questions in the Q&A, which is next to the tasks button on your screen. So please click it there, type in your question. The questions will be anonymous, so do add your name if you would like us to know who's asking the question. And we will collect those and pose them to the panelists later. Okay, let's see if we have any answers yet for our second question. Do we have that one? Yes. Okay, so we can see who's here. Wow, this is fantastic. We have a really good mix. We have some people from NGOs. We have some people from the private sector, from multinationals. We have a lot of entrepreneurs and some also from UN entities. So, okay, this is great. Well, welcome everyone. It's very exciting that we have so many different people here. And again, this is also reflected, I believe, very much in our diverse and exciting panel. So I think you're all well aware from the title of the session that the topic today is women's unpaid care work. But the intersection of care, work, and paid work isn't always so clear. And I just want to give a little bit of context as we begin our session. Care really refers to the provision of personal face-to-face services to meet our physical and emotional needs in order to allow people to function at a social level of capability, comfort, and safety. And caregiving is always complemented by daily domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, laundering, which are all necessary for individuals, families, societies, and ultimately for economies to function and thrive. But around the world, this work is predominantly done by women and girls. We shoulder a disproportionate share of care work, and it is usually unpaid, unrecognized, and undervalued. Before the COVID-19 crisis hit, women were already doing 3 times as much unpaid care work and domestic work as men. On average, women were doing around 4 hours of domestic and unpaid care work in our region, compared to men doing less than 2 hours. This unequal sharing of unpaid care and domestic work has really serious consequences. It exacerbates gender gaps in earnings, it obstructs women from reaching their full economic potential, and it even restricts women's participation in community and in politics. It's a major reason why many women in many parts of our region are outside of the labour force. And even before the COVID-19 pandemic, Asia Pacific was actually the only region in the world with declining rates of female labour force participation. And at the same time, calculations by McKinsey Global showed that the unpaid care work undertaken by women in Asia and the Pacific, if it was included in the measurement of GDP, would add $3.8 trillion to the regional total, which means around 15% of the region's GDP. So that just gives you an idea of what a significant and far-reaching issue we're talking about in this session. With the onset of the pandemic, this unequal burden of care work and its ramifications for women's ability to participate has been exacerbated. In ASEAN member states, women have noted 30% increases in the intensity of unpaid care and domestic work since the pandemic began, whereas only 16% of men have found the same effect. A larger share of women in formal employment have seen their paid work hours reduce at the same time. Research projects that 140 million full-time paid jobs may be lost as a result of the pandemic. Women's employment is about 20% more at risk than men's. When it comes to the policy responses in our region, we know based on data from the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker, as of September last year, that measures to support unpaid care work during this crisis have been scarce in our region. So as lockdowns continue, more children require care, employers do have a major role to play in supporting women to stay in the workforce. A recent study by UN Women and ILO, the Policy Landscaping Report in ASEAN and Women's Economic Empowerment, showed that among 75 top ASEAN companies, only 12 of them, or 16%, reported having policies or facilities available to support employees in caring for children and other dependents. So this unpaid burden, this unequal burden of unpaid care work is really a systemic issue that requires a very holistic, multi-stakeholder approach. So today, with our panelists here, we'll be able to really bring together some of the different people, some of the different players and sectors that need to be part of this solution. We'll be looking at unpaid care work through a lens of trying to transform these challenges into opportunities, expanding on innovative approaches that we may not have looked at in large scale before. But first, before we go on to our panel, we'd like to get into the details of the data a little bit more. I'm really pleased to have with us an expert speaker who will present a snapshot of where we stand as a region on unpaid care and how COVID-19 has affected both men and women's participation in paid work. So now I'd like to hand over to Cecilia Tinonin of UN Women Regional Office for Asia Pacific. Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. Today, I will provide a very brief overview of where do we stand in terms of unpaid domestic and care work in the region. So I'll start to discuss the employment gaps in the distribution between men and women prior to COVID-19. And when we look at this distribution, we see, as Sarah just mentioned, that women are likely to be less employed than men, and this is true throughout the years between 1991 and 2018. And secondly, a second message that is particularly important to consider is that this trend has been worsening over time with the gender gaps in employment to population ratio increasing between 1991 and 2018. And we know that control over resources, especially income derived from a wage, is one of the major key determinants for economic empowerment for both men and women. Next slide, please. Prior to COVID-19, gender gaps were severe not only in the world of paid work, but also in the world of unpaid work. When we look at the average time spent in unpaid domestic and care work and volunteer work disaggregated by sex in selected countries in the region, even visually, we immediately see that women spend more time on a daily basis, on average, in comparison to men, to the provision of unpaid services to the household, the family, and the community. However, when we look at the distribution of time spent in subsistence and paid work disaggregated by sex in the same selected countries, we see immediately, even visually again, that is men who actually devoted more time on a daily basis to paid work, employment, and subsistence agriculture. Next slide, please. The unequal allocation of time to unpaid domestic and care work within the household and among family members is a key barrier to women economic empowerment and women participation to the labor force. And this is particularly worrisome, obviously, in context where employment rates for women are among the lowest in the world, such as, for instance, in Central and Southern Asia. This figure that is drawn from a report produced by UN Women and the ILO in 2020, so very recent, shows that women's employment is shaped by domestic and caregiving responsibilities in a way that is not for men. So in both Central and Southern Asia and Southern Eastern Asia, the labor force participation of women is highest among lone household person, and sharply decreases when women live in a couple-only household. But when we look more importantly at the employment rate when women live in household with children under 6, we see that this drops more for women than men. In fact, data shows us that men's employment rate increases with the formation of a family, which is the contrary for women. Next slide, please. So when we look at care jobs in Asia Pacific, the ILO actually classify Asia Pacific as a model of low levels of care employment. And this care employment is characterized mainly by a small care workforce, male-dominated care workforce, with the except of Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Men outnumber women care workers. This workforce is mainly engaged in the public sector, and a high prevalence of informal care employment is actually characterized by severe gender gaps, with women workers' level of informality outnumbering men's. As Sarah has said, investing in care will add more women to the workforce because it's gonna soften the barriers to access to the labor market. And more investment in the care economy in 9 countries in the region could generate 182 million more jobs by 2030. These were estimated before the COVID crisis hit. Advancing gender equality in Asian Pacific could also add 4.5 trillion to the regional GDP by 2025, 50% of which is expected to come from improving women's labor force participation. So next slide, please. We knew that at UN Women that prior to COVID-19, there were severe gender gaps in the world of both paid and unpaid work, especially in Asia and Pacific. So when the pandemic hit, we had a lot of questions, such as were women losing their jobs, who was in the household that was taking care of unpaid domestic and care work, and what were the consequences of this increased demand for unpaid caregiving services within the household, were vulnerable groups getting poorer. So the overall simple question that we all asked within the organization and among different stakeholders was, what are the effects of COVID-19 on gender equality in the region? Next slide, please. So we partner with the private sector, in particular with 11 countries with mobile service providers to roll out rapid gender assessment surveys in the region immediately after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, so in March 2020. And these data are not official statistics, but have really informed gender responsive recovery schemes and policy in the region. Next slide, please. I'm now going to present a few key results of our research. So we know that during crisis, economic recession, natural disaster, in general, men tend to step up and do more unpaid domestic and care work in comparison to normal times. And this is true also during the COVID-19 pandemic. So when measured through time increase in one activity only, we definitely see that men has been contributed more because the demand of unpaid domestic and care work were actually higher during lockdowns, regulations throughout the region, and we can say throughout the world. However, when we look at the intensity of the care burden, that is measured through time spent in at least 3 activities related to unpaid domestic and care work, so the increased time in comparison to normal time, we see that actually is women who are carrying the heaviest burden in comparison to men. So unpaid domestic and care work has been really an essential service during the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is something that has been increasingly highlighted in different forums. Even the World Economic Forum has recently called for increased attention to the increased burden in care giving services, both paid and unpaid, related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. We also unfortunately saw that social norms are still at play, with women and men declaring that their girls are actually doing, their daughters are doing more in the household to the provision of unpaid domestic and caregiving services. So girls are helping more actually than boys. And again, we saw that it's really the household, the family, who is absorbing the increasing demands for unpaid domestic and care work. 34% of our respondents indicated in the region that they actually let go their domestic workers during the pandemic, probably in view of fear of contagion. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic on the labor market, and these rapid gender assessment surveys were actually rolled out immediately, as I said, after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. So this data refers to the first round, but it's been something that has been recently reaffirmed also by the ILO in their Women Employment and Social Outlook released a few days ago. And the key messages are that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected both men and women. So we have 63% of people who saw their income decrease since the start of the pandemic. But we know that there are gender gaps, and in particular in working hours. So 50% of women in formal employment in comparison to 35% of men actually noted a decrease in working hours in formal employment. And when we look at informal workers, we see that the great majority obviously is now protected by social protection, and they have not actually received benefits, unemployment benefits, or government financial supports. And this is true regardless of gender, both female and men. So what are our key takeaways? Next slide, please. Prior to COVID-19, I think we can all agree and are aware that there were gender gaps in labor force participation, with women at a disadvantage. And the unequal distribution of unpaid domestic and care work among family and household members definitely act as a barrier to women economic empowerment and labor force participation. When we look at the care employment module in the region, it's characterized by a low level of care employment. The main characteristics we saw were a small workforce, mainly formal and male dominated in the public sector. So COVID-19 is actually deepening pre-existing gender inequalities in the world of both work, paid and unpaid work. And we know that women are at risk of even getting out of the active workforce. So meaning not simply out of employment, but not even looking for a job anymore, because simply they have no time anymore to deal with looking for a job and taking care of the family and the household members due to the increased demands for domestic and care work. For a gender-sensitive recovery, therefore, care employment should expand further, and decent jobs should be created for care workers to support a gender-sensitive recovery. Gender data is key to provide evidence on the gender effect of the current pandemic and to inform this gender-sensitive recovery. And in particular, we are advocating for developing international statistical standards on the care economy, care jobs, and entrepreneurship to increase visibility of care in official statistics and therefore decision-making. Thank you so much. I'm giving back the floor to Katia.
Thank you very much indeed, Cecilia, for really setting the scene with that deeper dive into the data. I'd now next like to hand over to my colleague Katia Freiwald from our UN Women in We Empower Asia.
Sarah, and thank you very much, Cecilia. It's always enlightening to listen to all this interesting data. I'm very thrilled to have actually the opportunity now to speak to a very exciting woman and a dear friend of mine, Nadira Yusuf. And Nadira is going to join us today in a triple-headed capacity. So Nadira is the lead in Malaysia for the ASEAN Women's Network, AVEN. Nadira is also We Empower Asia champion. So she has been supporting the We Empower Asia program, which is led by UN Women and in partnership with the European Union, and is actually hosting today's session, which we are very grateful for. But foremost, Nadira is joining us today as the CEO and founder of KiddoCare. So Nadira, thank you very much for being once again with us and sharing your wisdom, learning about unpaid care work, but in a very innovative and very practical way. To get us started, just maybe give us a little bit of an introduction to what KiddoCare is and how did you come up with the idea to found KiddoCare?
Thank you, Katja. It's always a pleasure to come in and share with everyone about what we do, and hopefully we can inspire more private sector initiatives to come in and help solve the problem. So what KiddoCare is that it's a platform, it's an online platform, the digital platform that was built to help parents solve their childcare concerns or their childcare problems. So what we wanted to really achieve was something that was inspired by myself, being an entrepreneur. The needs for childcare is unconventional. So different times, different place, all those sorts of things. So I couldn't find one that fits basically my requirement. There were times when I was so absorbed at work that I forgot to pick up my children from the childcare center at night. So don't judge me, but yeah, that happens, right? So I figured, if I can't find a solution that works, I wanted to create one to help others also. So I work a lot with women entrepreneurs as well as women in professional. And when we were talking about it, there were so many initiatives that involves empowering women. So there were a lot of efforts to get women to start their business, to go into workforce and whatnot. But really, if you don't solve the problem of childcare for them, then they will forever have that kind of a feeling that they cannot really pursue what they want. So we wanted to come in and help them. So what we did was we developed a platform that uses technology, and technology is meant for us to improve the current conditions in terms of accessibility, making childcare safer and more reliable. And what's the other reason why we created this, because we wanted to also make sure that women who works in childcare or the childcare workers can actually earn decent income, improve their work conditions, as well as allow them a path where they can build upon their career and just build on that and eventually become an entrepreneur within the industry as well. So that was the whole reason how we started and why we started.
And Nadira, knowing a little bit already about your model, but maybe our audience today doesn't. So can you explain just a little bit the sort of, you have a network of caregivers, and how does it work? How do they find kind of their customers, or how do you work with them? And how, me as a mother, how would I perceive that service that I'm getting? How do you make sure that it's safe and that I can trust this? Could you give a little bit more detail on that?
Well, because we're mothers building products for other parents, right? So we wanted to make sure that first and foremost, we solve the whole safety issue or security issue first. So it has been pretty conventional, I guess, within the region for you to look at childcare or childcare providers being institutional childcare providers, which is great, right? And we will forever need them. But how KiddoCare is coming in, we're basically complementing the need for outside conventional childcare times, right? So what we do is that we dispatch our childcare providers into the houses or whichever location that is required. So it is a more personalized childcare services. And really, we wanted to make sure that the women who comes in are able and capable to deliver the service. So KiddoCare actually set up what we call our KiddoCare Academy that allows them to come in and be skilled. So we train them in terms of childcare, safety, first aid, and CPR. We do the psychometric assessment on them, health check, and all that. So it's a very strict process for you to come in and on board. So, you know, all women are welcome to join us, but not everyone can eventually become a caregiver. And we even have a 1 week hand-holding session. So when they first start into their first jobs, within that first week, we actually have mentors to actually guide them throughout. And the other thing that we use technology for is to ensure that they could follow the SOPs that we set. So, you know, I guess many parents have that concern of like, you know, who's coming in to take care of my child, and will I be getting the same person over and over, you know, that kind of thing. But with technology, we are able to sort of standardize or make the quality of service consistent, that, you know, it doesn't matter who comes in, you will experience the same level of service. So that was the other thing that we were very particular about, and we put in a lot of effort into that. So the key here is to allow parents to have access to quality childcare provider anytime they require. So they have to just go onto our website or use our app and just tell us when you need, where you need, and the caregiver will actually go to you.
Thank you, Nadira, for sharing this. I think it makes it very tangible. I do remember when we've met you for the first time, you were in 2018. I think you were just about to start KiddoCare. I think you have been 1 year, a bit more in business, and then unfortunately the pandemic hit us, and you were very young as a business. So how did you manage this as an entrepreneur in your business, and what impact did that have on KiddoCare in such an early phase of starting a business?
So we're about 2.5 years now. We're actually quite, I would consider ourselves pretty lucky, because I think, you know, the pandemic has proven that we have to look at different models to address childcare. We all know that, you know, it is a concern for you to group children in large groups. So when the pandemic hit and the childcare centers were closed, so we were basically the solution for the frontliners. So our doctors, our nurses, the police, people who are working on the ground during the pandemic, to come in and get us to help them. And the beauty about having to use technology is that we are able to then exercise better control, as in, you know, we could allow certain carers to go into certain houses and allow that kind of, you know, what do you call that? A certain amount of quarantine to make sure that, you know, we limit the risk of actually spreading COVID to the next person and things like that. So there's actually a beauty in this. And the other side is, you know, during the pandemic, so many women were losing their jobs, especially from the hospitality industry, from the hotel industry, airlines. And we became the go-to for women to actually come in and earn income. So we worked a lot in repurposing their skills in hospitality and airlines to becoming a caregiver. So that allowed them to, you know, even if they don't intend to go into the career as a full-timer, that they could build that interest and start, you know, earning income during that time. So we were also a vehicle for women to pick up and earn income when, you know, they were losing their jobs. So it was pretty good for us. The other thing that we saw was that we could come in and help and support other childcare centers as well. When they were closed, you know, they were experiencing operational issues. They couldn't sustain their business and whatnot. So we would then help them and work with them in terms of, you know, giving the opportunities for their teachers or their caregivers to come in and work during that time. And we manage them. So this allowed them to, you know, have some kind of a cushion in terms of operating their businesses and allow them to sustain even longer. So we see ourselves as very complementing within the period, not just to those who needed our support, but also to the ecosystem of the childcare industry.
Thank you, Nadira. It's really enlightening listening to you. For me, it's kind of, why don't we have more models like yours, and how can we replicate this? And I just want to bring our audience also into the conversation here. So just for everyone, we keep hearing from Nadira, don't worry. But there's in the task button, there is a little question for all of you. What needs to be done to actually scale up models like Nadira's? What's needed out there. So please share your thoughts with us. In the meanwhile, I'm going to post that same question also to Nadira and then say, Nadira, I'm sure it sounds for us, if we listen till here, it sounds all only positive, but I'm sure that there were obstacles, there are challenges. So could you share a little bit more? Why do models like yours don't scale faster, or what are kind of obstacles and challenges that you are seeing currently to scale up your model?
So there are a few key challenges. In the beginning when we were starting, it was about changing the mentality of the market to accept, especially within our region. Where we're actually even more comfortable with sending our children to childcare centers, or to somebody we know, or somebody we were recommended to, into the houses of your neighbors. Or we've always been a society where we depended on our own families, our fathers, our grandparents to take care of the children, but the lifestyle has changed. So in the beginning, it was about changing that kind of perception, and creating that kind of comfort of allowing others to come into your home. So that's one. Number two, of course, is about trying to manage the supply and the demand, and it's always within the supply side. So getting enough caregivers, having them to go through the process of training and onboarding. It's initially it was pretty tough. Trying to get people to come in and say, okay, I'm comfortable enough to go into a stranger's house to take care of their children. So that's the concern comes on both ways. So we had to go and address that. And the onboarding has to be fast enough, so also make sure that we could cater to the demand. So we have to recruit fast enough. The other thing was that I guess we faced also in the very beginning a lot of criticism and also skepticism from the other industry players who thought that we were coming in to disrupt them, but we were actually coming in to complement them. So when this happens, we had to make sure that we were there to support and not to break the existing childcare system. And there were also issues with regulations, because we're new models. We're a new model, so childcare has always been institutionalized. So what about this? Where do we fall under? Which ministry should we be talking to? So it was never like that. So when we want to scale up, say within the region, and every country has got its own policy and regulations, so it's quite difficult for us to expand because of this. So every time we move in somewhere, it's always different policies and different regulation. There is no certain standard for us to adopt within, say, the region, to say this is the minimum industry requirement, this is the minimum industry SOP. So it's easier for us to actually move it around. So these are the three things that's very important. And I think number 4 would be also key, which we discovered during the pandemic. We had to also balance affordability, what parents could pay, against having to give them good decent income, right? Because if not, they will forever be low income earners, and you cannot get quality with low income. So we had to balance that, and we see this is where we need to look into new models where the government can come in to support parents who need this kind of services. We can't say we don't want to look at it, because we have seen COVID changing the way people work, cooperation works. So a lot of things like this. So we have to really look into this new model. Thank you.
Great. And I think people won't be surprised if I'm just saying from all the experience that Nadira has shared, I think it's great to hear as well that KiddoCare has received investments from real investors into her business. And we're going to be hearing a little bit more about how this works and how this went later on in the panel as well. But I just want to also share, before we go to the word cloud and really kind of want to look at what you have to say on how we really could scale these kind of models. Nadira has been an inspiration for us as well to set up a new program about which we will hear a little bit more in a second. But if we maybe just could quickly pull this up, we have just recently launched a program which is called the UN Women Care Accelerator. We see the word cloud popping up here, but so the program is really a program that helps and is designed to support enterprises like Nadira's and others to really create new and innovative solutions for more affordable, more accessible, and more qualitative childcare services, but really taking an ecosystem approach and really engaging different stakeholders out of the ecosystem. And we will have a chance to hear more about this later on in the panel from some of our speakers. But thank you so much, Nadira, for sharing your experience with us and being such a great inspiration to really drive change into the care economy. And I hope we're going to be hearing a little bit more also from our other panelists about that. But I guess we have a good model in mind and seeing how a good look like. And with that, I'm going to hand it over back to my dear colleague, Sarah. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Katia. It was really great to hear from you and from Nadira. So now turn to the panel discussion. After hearing about KiddoCare and the Care Accelerator, I think we've really heard that there's more scope for market-based solutions to offer some accessible, quality and affordable care opportunities that also allow women to take advantage of paid employment at the same time as creating opportunities for decent work for others. But as we've seen from the data and also heard from Nadira, in order to make this happen, we need really bold and collaborative efforts by a range of key stakeholders to create an enabling environment that's required for such models to flourish. So I'm really pleased that today we have a panel that's quite diverse, that looks at this from different perspectives, and will really be able to share something about this whole ecosystem. To start us off and to really help to frame our discussion a bit more, I'd like to turn first to Ms. Richa Singh. Richa is the Research and Policy Lead in Asia for Oxfam, and she's going to tell us about a new framework that Oxfam has developed to support institutions, including the private sector and IFIs, to become more care responsive. So Richa, I'd just like to start off with one question for you. We know that Oxfam has been a leading organisation in undertaking research and advocating for holistic approaches to address unpaid care work. As we start looking into solutions, could you tell us a bit more about the 5R framework and how it can be used to not only advocate for these market-based approaches, like the one that KiddoCare is using, but also how can it guide governments, investors and corporates to become more care responsive? Richa, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And it's always a pleasure joining hands with UN Women and seeing how we can address women's unpaid and underpaid care work. As our research actually validates the research findings that Cecilia shared, that women's care work has suffered a lot during the pandemic, where women are increasingly disempowered. Oxfam has been working with a model to try and change this and try and see what can be the pathways out of this situation. And we largely use the 4R framework, but increasingly recognize that there's a 5th R, that is of reward, which must also be taken into account. As we've been discussing, women's unpaid and underpaid care work is not recognized, and as a result, it goes unaccounted for, be it in policy analysis or be it in economic analysis within households, by market. And as a result, women and caregivers themselves undervalue the work. The work is not seen as decent work. It's not, a living wage is not paid for it. So the first R is really to get that recognition for women's, the care work that women do that keeps societies and economies running. The second is really to find ways of reducing it. And one is, of course, the whole issue of technology, that how do we bring in technology to reduce the drudgery of women's the care work that they do. Second is also, and that brings us to the third R, is to try and redistribute it. So how do we begin to also involve that men also take up the responsibility and social norms around that changes so that the work gets redistributed. But I think that's not enough. There's also a need to redistribute care work, not just within the household, but away from the household to the state's involvement, to the market's involvement, to the private sector's involvement, and really increase that space for the kind of inspirational model that we heard from Nadira. And the fourth is really then to address underpaid care work that women do, work that is paid, but not really the value that it deserves. And that brings us to the next two R's, is really about representations, that women, the caregivers, find that space at the policy table, in different policies, where so that the care work gets addressed. And the fifth R is really about reward, that there is adequate reward to the kind of work that women do to keep societies and communities and economies running. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richa. Those 5 R's are really memorable, and I think they really help us capture some of the key points. Now I'd like to us talk a little bit more about the work that Oxfam has done in creating the CARE principles. Could you tell us a bit about how they guide particularly corporates to provide employer-supported care, and also how are enterprises like Nadira's reflected in those principles? Over to you, Richa.
So the CARE principles that we've been working with, it emerges from some research that we've done, where we found that, in fact, be it governments, be it civil society organizations, or be it private sector, IFIs like the World Bank or the ADB and others, there is a commitment to gender equality. And yet the care perspective is totally lacking across the organizations. And unless the women's unpaid and underpaid care work is addressed, the question of addressing gender equality remains incomplete. What we found that despite this commitment, there was often, despite the will being there was a knowledge gap. And so we tried to develop what we call the CARE principles, and this has been collaboratively developed with other organizations, including care workers, and the CARE principles are meant to serve as guidelines to corporates, to governments, to civil society organizations and IFIs to address the issue of unpaid care work. And the CARE principles, in order to do so, we also help that the principles can be implemented and assessed. We've also developed what we call the Care Barometer, and the Care Barometer provides a checklist which enables any official to have some self-guided questions by which they can see and check in case there is any violations. And there are also 3 measures of progress by which they can see whether they totally meet up in addressing and integrating care work. So there's the amber light, the red light, the green light, by which officials can actually measure their progress as well as prevent violation. And I think, for instance, there are certain aspects of the CARE principles, and I can quickly remember the principle 15, which actually stresses the need for policies and policies as far as care work is concerned, because unless there are policies, there are no investments that go into the care economy and into the care work. So also to have to expand the fiscal space and investment into the care economy and into care services. So that directly goes into the kind of models, and when there is investment, we would actually have more such models as we like kiddo care, and that's as Katya said, that's really what we need. More innovative approaches, but that cannot happen unless the money and investments go in. Also, there are different, for instance, there's also important that corporates or other stakeholders also involve the stakeholders and the caregivers when in the policy making decisions. So even once you have these policies, for instance, even within IFIs or even within organizations, let's say Oxfam or UN Women and others, that we actually involve the caregivers and people involved in the care work into the decision making process. Also, there we also address in the principles the whole issues of the need for that social network that caregivers need. So a representation also involves a collective bargaining. Similarly, the whole issue of reward. So the care principles actually look at the gamut of these issues, which would be very useful for corporates and IFIs, governments, to simply address what they talk about, and that's to address gender equality.
Thank you so much, Richa. Thank you very much. I think that you've really emphasized for us that to address this unequal burden of care work, we really need a multi-stakeholder approach. And of course, this means that we need the right policy environment for solutions. So I'm very pleased now that we turn to our next distinguished panelist, who is Dr. Anu Munkur, who is the co-founder and co-director of Equalis, to look a little bit more into the policy environment for care enterprises. So Anu, I'd like to ask you a question about this. Looking at a wider perspective on policy making, you've actually conducted a policy landscaping study for UN Women, looking at the regulatory framework for care enterprises in the region. Could you please share with us some of the key findings? Where does our region stand on regulation of care businesses, and what are some of the major current gaps in legislation? Over to you, Anu.
Thank you so much. I think one of the first things we need to recognize is that privatized childcare is a relatively recent phenomenon in this region. And really the focus seems to have come from early childhood education, which has prompted governments to really look into what kinds of policies need to be in place to support quality, affordable childcare. So what we are seeing in the region is that governments are having to negotiate a really wide range of services, everything from daycare and creches and preschools that are managed by, managed as small business, that are started by stay-at-home moms and housewives, either in their own homes or in separate residential buildings, to much more professionalized services that are well established and sometimes even national franchisees. And these franchisees are actually quite interesting because they offer corporates opportunities for on-site childcare as well as off-site childcare services. Some preschools are attached to larger schools as part of their kindergarten or Montessori program. So it's not surprising that the policy environment is really pretty complex and quite difficult for entrepreneurs to navigate, who also, apart from looking at all the education side of things, have to look at the business related regulations as well. I feel that adding to this complexity is having to deal with different government departments, and there's often no centralized agency responsible for looking at childcare. So sometimes entrepreneurs have to deal with the Department of Education and the Department of Social Services and the Department of Women, the Department of Labor, and add another layer to that. They also have to look at local and state level administrative structures in countries like India and Indonesia, where the system is really highly decentralized. So across the region, what we're seeing are really wide variations in the depth and scope of childcare service policies in all the countries that we looked at, and that is India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. There's an increasing reliance on private daycare and creches, especially among middle and upper class groups. What is encouraging is that regulations require employers to provide a range of childcare services. Private daycare is often run either as a social enterprise or a for-profit business or as a non-profit venture. And there's really a growing market for these services. In all the countries that we looked at, daycare centers must be licensed. And in some countries like Indonesia, they are required to be accredited as well. The other thing that we found is that there are varying levels of subsidies that are provided to support access to childcare. In Thailand, for example, there is a child benefit, which is approximately about $20 a month, that can be accessed by employees whose employer makes contributions to the Social Security Fund. And there are other criteria around children's age eligibility and the number of children. So it's capped at the number of children as well. I would say that Philippines and Malaysia are perhaps the most mature when it comes to having policies to regulate childcare services. Sarah, in terms of the question around gaps, there remains a big question around compliance and who ensures compliance, how often, and it's unclear as to what the penalties are for non-compliance. Another gap is that there are very few regulations on the qualifications required for being a caregiver, and where they exist, they are not really strictly enforced. So in India, for example, there is no policy that recognizes childcare as professional work, requiring professional qualifications, and therefore you have no professional accreditation systems. By contrast, in Indonesia, there are really high standards for caregiving staff, especially childcare, which sees child caregivers almost as equivalent as a teacher's assistant. And so there are requirements for things like a bachelor's degree or a 4-year diploma. And a third gap, I think, is linking the employment of caregivers to existing labor laws. So it's really very unclear if existing labor laws applies to caregivers, which has traditionally been seen as a service that has been provided informally. So should entrepreneurs providing childcare services, provide staff with contracts? What entitlements are staff entitled to in terms of leave, insurance, etc.? What should be the minimum wage? And where the minimum wage is actually prescribed, it's unclear whether that's actually regulated enough to ensure that that is actually being paid. And there's really nothing around childcare providers' responsibility for staff development and career path progression. So this sets up the possibility of caregivers continuing in insecure work without decent wages. I think a fourth gap is the lack of really clear guidelines and policies around child safety. So things like police checks for staff working with children. This doesn't seem to have come up in any of the policies that we looked at. A fifth gap is the link around migration policies and people working overseas. We know that many service providers provide opportunities for women to work overseas as nannies and in other types of caregiving arrangements. So what policies are related to migrant overseas workers apply to entrepreneurs providing these services? That is extremely unclear. And I think I'll end with some food for thought. I think market-based approaches to childcare entrepreneurship is an innovative solution to addressing the increasing demand for childcare in the region. However, these businesses, whether they are led by women or not, must think about how they walk their talk on gender equality. So they need to be looking at things like pay gaps, access to parental leave, access to leave for domestic and family violence. Otherwise, I think what we're doing is just perpetuating the exploitation that we see in the informal caregiving economy. Second, I think it's really interesting to see how caregiving is adopting the modalities of a gig economy. And there are lots of challenges to this type of setup, as we've seen with some big names that have been pulled up on labor abuses. So the governments are really going to have to think about how they're going to regulate this gig economy when it comes to caregiving. And finally, I feel really strongly that unless nationally and internationally we look at shifting gendered social norms on caregiving, this work will continue to be seen as women's work.
Thank you so much, and thank you for raising
Sarah.
that very important point, Anu, at the end. And I couldn't agree more with you that we have to keep looking into these deep contextual issues as well. I was also wondering, in the landscaping, did you find some kinds of legislation and policy that have been successful in incentivizing employers to support and implement care solutions for their employees? Could you share some of those?
Thanks. It's actually difficult to answer this question, as there's not really been an assessment that looks at what types of legislations and policies are successful in incentivizing employers. We do have some anecdotal evidence not from this region, but international examples. I would say that what is definitely required are really clear requirements for employers is the first step. I mean, I think employers themselves are beginning to see the benefits of supporting employees' caregiving responsibilities and are actually sometimes ahead of governments and coming up with internal policies to support these roles. There are examples, I think there are interesting examples from OECD countries that we can look to see how we can tailor and adapt them to the Asia context. In the UK, for example, there are incentives to encourage workplace initiatives where the full cost of a nursery place is provided by the employer is exempt from national insurance contributions. In UK, Ireland, and Netherlands, they offer what's called demand-led funding. That is, income through tax credits or tax incentives of some kinds are given directly to parents to enable them to choose and pay for childcare in the private market. In France, companies are doing something quite interesting. They are pooling together to provide creche facilities for their employees. There are recent legislative changes in France and the UK to look at financial incentives for groups of employers to collaborate on childcare. So, putting up the establishment of creches within, much more within the financial reach of smaller companies who can then work with larger ones and providing these services to their employees. So it's still a space that we need to look into more to find really good examples of best practice, I think.
Thank you very much indeed, Anu, and we'll look forward to come back to you hopefully in the Q&A later, but thank you so much for that. So we've heard about how progressive policies and a favourable regulatory framework are really, really important to move the needle on this care issue. But it's also crucial that there's more investment in this area as well. So to give us the perspective of an investor, but also to speak to how investments can spur innovation, we're turning now to Mr. Anurag Malu, who is the Head of Partnerships with SeedStars. So Anurag, SeedStars is an impact investor that also runs acceleration programs for entrepreneurs. Can you tell us what made SeedStars interested to partner with UN Women for the Care Accelerator? And can you tell us a bit about how the program will build the capacity of the care entrepreneurs who take part? Anurag, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. I believe it's a great opportunity to complement the expertise two organizations bring here, UN Women and SeedStars, and both equally committed to furthering gender equality and inclusion, where UN Women's empowerment experience on unpaid care, boosting women entrepreneurship, and working with private sector. And if you pair that with SeedStars experience, as you said, on impact investing, that's how we kind of, came together. Let's do this UN Women Care Acceleration Program to increase women's labor force participation and building more inclusive economy. And I think SeedStars' mission has always been, how do we impact people's lives in emerging markets through technology, entrepreneurship, and investment? And all of these elements are coming together and, leveraging that to transform now care sector into more inclusive opportunity. And I think that's what we need to kind of recognize, that the role care work plays in our society and how important is that. And we must pay attention to the industry as a whole and empower entrepreneurs in the care sector by providing more growth opportunities as a public and private sector partnership now, how we can prioritize more investment into care work to create more equal and gender inclusive economic recovery post even COVID pandemic. So I think to walk you through a little bit about this UN Women Care Acceleration Program and what we are doing in this program to build capacity of care entrepreneurs, maybe I think we move to the next slide. In that, I will quickly walk through, our objectives of this acceleration program and how, the focus will be on capacity building. So first is really identifying the care startups and then doing, assessment, where do they stand, understand if they are leveraging technology and how they are leveraging technology. Not necessarily every startup that will be part of it will have a tech component, but we would like to kind of consider that. and understand their own journey of like profitability and identifying their product market fits. Then another will be around how do we reduce unpaid work by obviously identifying the innovative solutions, and how they are turning those challenges into employment and business opportunities. Then provide coaching to these care ventures around lean methodologies, providing mentorship support. And at the same time, I think it's a sector which is not fully developed yet. It needs a lot of peer-to-peer learning amongst other entrepreneurs. So a lot of practical applications you will see where entrepreneurs will have a chance to work with each other, and that will also create more collaboration opportunities amongst them. And the most important component I think I want to talk about is with this program, we want to take this opportunity to also train and attract, sensitized investors and train them also on gender lens investing and build their capacity. Ourselves, Seed Stars, we are also learning, and at the same time, how do we involve others to join hands and create this, a network of investors who are more sensitized towards the needs of care economy and the innovative, and support the innovative care startup ecosystem. So I think that's kind of an overview of how we would like to build the capacity, not just of entrepreneurs, but also investors, and support the goals we have ahead. I think we can move to the next slide also. I think I will share a little more details, but not get into, in the entire program. But the focus on the program will be various boot camps. We'll conduct various experience sharing sessions. We'll diagnose all the companies that will be joining as part of this program, and then overall engagement of mentors, sector experts from UN Women, and also other gender experts, along with the investor community, and providing them all the necessary tools and resources they need to really become successful. That's what we hope to achieve, with this program, and help, identifying how do we transform these caregiving challenges into true employment and business opportunities. Is that kind of answers your question? I've tried to cover various aspects.
Absolutely, Anurag. It's such an exciting initiative. I just wanted to ask a kind of quick follow-up, actually, because obviously what we're really trying to do here is to encourage investors to make more gender-smart investment decisions. So I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about really how you sensitize investors and how you raise awareness, not just of the social benefits of this type of investment, but also on what the return on investment is in terms of funding women-owned and women-benefiting businesses. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great question, for sure. I would say Seed Stars is in early stages of our even own journey in pursuing gender lens investing, but we are committed to it, to furthering as I said, gender equality and inclusion, and we've also formally committed ourselves to the UN Women Empowerment Principles as one of the signatories. We're already partnering with leading other international organizations like IFC or GIZ or UN Women, and then organizations who are working on and doing gender work for a long time, like Bob Inc. and Value for Women, on women-centered entrepreneurship programs and bringing gender lens to helping build gender lens to our capacity building and investment programs. So we are also working towards increasing our own internal capacity as an organization, as an investor, and really lead that by example, so that we can influence and other investors too. But I think overall, if when it comes to sensitization amongst other investors and raising awareness, I would say it's very important to develop an organization strategy, gender strategy, and embed that into the investment thesis you have, and making sure we are organizing gender lens investment training for our own staff and people, and for our portfolio companies, have gender related KPIs and impact metrics for our portfolio businesses. How do we include gender into our due diligence process, in our selection criteria, more driving engagement towards of gender forward practices within our portfolio companies. I think there, and also I think in terms of when it comes to funding mechanisms, to support women entrepreneurs, or like in context to care entrepreneurs? How do we have to be more mindful to what works? Is it necessarily has to be an equity focused, or it could be like grant focused, or do we need to really look for alternate funding vehicles? Because this market, this opportunity so far in care is not necessarily understood well by everyone, and a lot of work needs to go in even creating that awareness. In terms of, I think, what we are looking at as an outcome is, along with obviously, financial investment as an ROI, but how do we make sure there are social and social returns along with the economic returns? I think one thing that we have noticed is the way a lot of focus on the word has been on, like climate smart investing. Similar to that, climate action, climate related solutions have got a lot of attention. How do we bring the same set of lens to the, gender smart investment? And so that as an industry as a whole, how do we, start talking about it, start reprioritizing the role, it has to impact in our societies, and the investors, how investor community can really contribute to it. So that's, I think, we're kind of the journey embarked on with UN Women with the Care Acceleration Program. This is still a pilot program. We're gonna learn from this, and at the same time, hopefully, we're gonna scale this in future and take it to the next level. And hopefully, I think by the time we execute and complete this first pilot phase, I hope we can create some momentum amongst various stakeholders to treat care economy as a core, like real economic sector, where there are right regulations in place, which others other speakers have talked about. There are right policies, frameworks that are necessary to help support the market-based solutions in care economy. So yeah, that's it, I think, from my side.
Thank you so much, Anurag, and I'm really excited to see the journey. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was great. So we've heard about how the Care Accelerator will support care entrepreneurs to gain skills and connections to investors in order to grow their businesses. But as Richard was emphasizing earlier, the private sector and corporate employers in particular do have a really key role to play in this change that we want to make. Family-friendly policies can include a range of actions, and research shows that providing on-site or near-site childcare facilities does help boost productivity and employee retention. So it eventually benefits businesses as well as families and women. So we're very excited to have with us today Ms. Asma Yusuf, who is the Head of People Experience and Operations for Bangladesh, Sri Lanka and Pakistan at Unilever, and she's also the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for Pakistan. Welcome, Asma. Asma, I'd like to ask you if you could please tell us a little bit more about Unilever's childcare model and why it started. Can you tell us about how it's resourced, who's providing the childcare, and how have you selected the provider? Asma, over to you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hope I'm audible. Hope you can see me. So just a little bit in terms of, where the whole support structure comes in. So I think it's important to note that even pre-COVID, there's always been a recognition of inclusive support systems, at Unilever. It was in about 2016 that the maternal well-being standard was launched globally, which mandated a few particular things. It mandated, that the maternity and paternity leave be in place. It mandated that flexible working policies be in place. And most importantly, it mandated that if a Unilever site has more than 50 women working, they have to have a creche/daycare facility on site. Flexibility was obviously, given in terms of what the creche facility should be like, depending on, the mandate in terms of the government, what the law entailed. However, there were some standards in place where you did need to have certain minimum standards of what a creche facility at a Unilever site should look like. However, this, even though this was launched in 2016, so all Unilever companies were given 2 years to basically implement the maternal global well-being standard into place. But if I look at particularly Pakistan, we actually have had an on-site daycare facility in place since 2003. This has been at our head office. And today, in 2018, actually, 6 of our other locations also have daycare facilities on site. And this includes our factories and sales offices. And this, like I mentioned, has been in line with the whole, if you have over 50 women working, you need to have a daycare facility. However, what we've done in Pakistan is that even if it isn't 50 women working, we've had a daycare facility put in because there are a few women and we want to make sure that their working standards are met. I think in terms of our specific vendor that we're using in Pakistan, so we've been using Catco. They've actually been around in Pakistan since around 2003. So Unilever and Catco, it was the first partnership that kind of happened in the area of daycare. When we launched, obviously it was a very, very small sort of area that we were creating for some of our working mothers. We did have to obviously follow a lot of audits and checks before we picked the vendor. Honestly, at that point, we didn't have too many daycare vendors in Pakistan. So we just looked at kind of the internal value system and just the regular process that we follow when, selecting vendors. But what we really, really liked about Catco is that they pitched themselves as a social enterprise program. They were well trained. They were very much in line with the local laws. And although we do have local laws in Pakistan, they're very provincial at the moment, and they do mandate that, if you have more than a certain number of women working with you, you are mandated a daycare. But, like some of the other panelists have spoken, these laws are not strictly implemented. And so it's the responsibility of the organization to ensure that they incorporate daycare facilities to ensure that women can work well. And that's the philosophy that Catco was operating with. So we brought Catco on board. We've been working with them for since 2003 now. We've had a really, really good experience with them. And what's really nice is that it's a shared model between the employer and the employee. So although Catco is on site and Unilever does pay for the majority of the cost, the employees have a very minimal subsidized amount that they have to contribute every month as well. The cap age is 6 years, and they've got like a separate section for infants and toddlers. So that's really nice as well. And what's worked really well is, it's not just the women who actually use our daycare at the head office, it's also the men. In the case where both parents are working and the woman is working somewhere where, where a daycare facility isn't available, the man can actually bring their kid to the daycare on site. And that works really well because it enables the whole, system of co-parenting and sharing responsibilities. So that's worked out really well. In Bangladesh, for example, just as another example, in South Asia, because it's a much, much smaller, population, the company actually covers the 100% cost for the daycare. So the different models operate differently in different countries and different locations, but just ensuring that, the minimum standard is met and a daycare facility is available. The one thing I would want to point out, though, however, is that obviously with the onset of COVID, that's really, really changed the way we look at, supporting our women working. For 8 months, the Pakistan office was completely work from home. And obviously the daycare had to be closed because parents weren't comfortable sending their kids. We were in a complete lockdown. And what that actually called for was a complete shift in flexibility. And for those 8 months when it was absolute work from home, with the daycare facility being closed, the sharing of responsibility at home, was a little more possible because most people were working from home 100%. However, now as we slowly move into a hybrid way of working, there is a really, really big need, we feel, to relook at the whole, what is flexible working? How do we support our women in need? Because we're kind of going back to that bit where, and we did see that as we've gone back to working from the office, a lot of women haven't been able to come back to work because of the fact that the daycare is still closed. And so it's very, very different to ensure that we really, really bring about that whole piece in terms of compassion and care when we look at our women. Because if you look at Pakistan, it does have one of the highest shares of unpaid care, in the world. And so what we've had to really, really focus on, in the absence of a daycare, is relook at our flexible working policies. And so we've basically, relaunched a complete flexible working policy where women and men both can actually choose if they choose to continue working from home, even as we go into the hybrid way of working. We also have a policy in place where if a woman does need to travel for work, which is very minimal these days, but should that happen, the company will pay for her 3-year-old. The cap is 3 years. If she's got a baby 3 years or below, the company will pay for the baby and a nanny to travel with the mother so that she can work effectively. And we're also actually looking at options for a nanny allowance in the absence of a daycare. And that's where CATCO has been really, really helpful, because they're actually offering their employees / nannies / care workers to actually come in and work, at their employees' homes so that the mother can come to the office if required. So these are the options that, we're looking at in terms of enabling women in this environment, because while the daycare has been extremely effective and a really, really big help in terms of support to allow women to work, need to obviously adapt to current times with the onset of COVID and continue to find more flexible ways of working to support our women. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, it does, Asma, and I am really grateful to you as well for reminding us that it's not just about the provision of childcare. It's actually about a flexible and sort of compassionate way of responding to the changing circumstances, which is something that it's very, very important to be contextualized. So thank you very much for that. So I'm very grateful to have heard the inputs from all of our panelists, and I'm just going to briefly turn back to Nadira, and then we'll keep some time to have a few questions from the audience has already shared. So Nadira, after listening to all of the panelists, I wanted to just ask you one more question, actually, and I was wondering if you could let us know what you think about the role of programs like the Care Accelerator in regards to shaping partnerships with investors, and tell us a little bit about what role investment has played for you in the process of growing kiddo care. Over to you, Nadira.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it is really important for us to have programs such as the Care Accelerator, because it could help to accelerate the scale of proven practices into other areas. So this is a problem that we have to address fast, and because of that, I think it is very important for us to find ways to scale as fast as possible, and really developing that kind of playbook is where I think accelerators such as SitStar can actually come in and roll it out and find entrepreneurs who can really develop it and carry it through. In my case, investments, it's really important. I think in any kind of entrepreneur ventures these days, especially startups, we really do need that kind of investment for the very, reason that we have to scale as fast as we can. And it is a technology-based solution, and we use technology basically because it could help us to solve the problem faster, more effective, and with lesser cost. So it is heavier on investment in the beginning, but as we roll out, it could even be a better more efficient in a way as we scale. So that's why investment is very key in this kind of business such as ours. It's innovation lab and technology, because we're constantly looking for ways to improve conditions, and it has to be done very fast. So I actually welcome UN and Sistars Care Accelerator. I hope myself that we could be one of the program participant, and whether we could share what we have done and best practices, or we'll be one of them who will be selected. So yes, impact investors, I think, is also very important. They are different from the normal investors because they do look at the long-term impact returns. And I think in such an industry, it is very important for the investors to also have that aspiration, not just to look into the financial ROI, but also the other impact that we can create. And of course, it will be a sustainable and a sustainable business as we go along. So that's my thought, Sarah.
Thank you very much indeed, Nazira. So once again, it's been wonderful to hear from all of the panelists. It's very, very rich, a very, very rich sharing that we had already. And not surprisingly, our audience has quite a few questions, and we have just about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to turn now to some of those questions. I'm going to begin with a question for Asma. Asma, if that's okay. So Asma, could you just let us know, for the amounts that employees have to pay towards the cost of their childcare, are those tiered according to their salary range? Over to you, Asma.
No, so it's not tiered against their salary range. It's actually a very, very minimal subsidized amount, which amounts to a really, really minimal part of their monthly salary. So it's almost minimal. It's just kind of there to bring in that accountability. It's not even very, very mentionable, actually. And in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, actually, they're not charged anything at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for responding to that question, Asma. I really appreciate it. Now I'm going to turn actually to a question that's for Richa. So Richa, this is a really interesting one about the impact of COVID. So could you tell us, in your experience, have we seen any increased investments into the care economy since the pandemic struck? Richa, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that's a very important question. Actually, not really, and that's pretty unfortunate. We have, for instance, looked at the World Bank investment in 4 Asian countries, and these are COVID-related investment. And we found very little. One, the care perspective has largely been missing even prior to the pandemic, and it continues even now. And so investments are pretty negligible that address care. And we have looked at cross-cutting issues, not simply about childcare, but water and sanitation, education, which all contribute to the care economy and reducing and addressing women's care load. But that investment has been very, very limited or negligible in the Asian countries that we've seen, for sure.
Thank you very much, Richa. So clearly there's a lot more advocacy to be done around this. And that's something I think we can all for sure take away from this conversation. Thank you very much. I'd actually like to turn to Anu now, if that would be okay. So Anu, I have a couple of questions for you, and maybe I'll ask you one of those now. So Anu, could you tell us, is there any guidance in the business and human rights approach on accounting for households' unpaid care work in the economy? Can you give us
that's an interesting question, Sarah. I'm not quite sure there is. And maybe this is something that we need to look at. I think, Richard's point about outlining the care principles, that's the first time I've seen something so comprehensively laid out that, looks at a multi-stakeholder approach to this issue. And I think there is scope for us to look at how we bring in those care principles into a business and human rights framework.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I think this is another point for our advocacy and our action. Now, I actually have a couple of questions now that are a little bit around the experience of the workers in the care economy. So there's one for Nadira and one for Anu. So I'll maybe turn first to Nadira. So Nadira, could you tell us some of your thoughts about how we can secure the safety of caregivers? How do we make sure that they are not harassed or abused by their employers? Nadira, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that question. We get this all the time, especially from women who wants to come in and join us. So again, we always turn to technology to do this. We ensure, so I can only speak from our experience and what we have been doing. And it has been working so far. We use technology to do this. Number one is that we sort of like so we actually have a monitoring system for all our services. So when our carers, we call them our carers, when they go for services, we actually know from the point that they start moving all the way until the point that they reach home. And we know exactly what's going on in the service as we ask them to actually log in at certain times, and we have an SOP that we automate, so we know what's going on at what time. We also make it very compulsory for them to update parents at certain hours, at certain period of time. So we know exactly if parents will also be comfortable knowing what's happening at home, and the carers will always be comfortable who's watching over them also. So this is the thing that we put in place. So we monitor them throughout. And we also put in elements such as insurance for them. We have a panic button on their phone, so in case if anything happens, then they can just call out for help. So those are among the safety issues that we try to address using technology. But there's also the background check that we do on parents, not just for the carers as well. So there's both sides of the coin.
Thank you so much, Nadira. So this is very helpful for us to understand how you're looking at the safety and security issue from the angles of both the parent or the family, and of course also for the care worker as well. So I've got one more question actually, which is looking at the protection of workers, and this one is for Anu. So Anu, given that so much caregiving in our region is done actually by domestic workers, many of them are migrant women workers and many are employed informally. So could you give us any thoughts about how these women can be protected in terms of labour law and regulation? Over to you, Anu.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I think what we have to do is to look at labor laws and labor codes in different countries, right, and see to what extent they bring domestic workers under those regulations. And it's, I think, and countries have different ways in which they do it. So there's no sort of one size fits all. But I think there are some things that we should be looking at. When we're looking at reforms to labor codes or labor laws, we should be looking at things like weekly hours of work. We should be looking at legislating a minimum wage that is a living minimum wage. We should be looking at entitlements to work. And really importantly, we should be looking at supports for unionization and allowing collective bargaining for these systems. I think countries that haven't adopted some of the ILO conventions need to start looking at those, Convention 189, for example, and Recommendation 201. The other conventions, 97 and 103, which looks particularly at migrant workers, And many of these conventions look at minimum wage, wage protection, maternity protection, social security, occupational health and safety. So I think what we need to start doing is to look at reforming labor codes to bring domestic workers in, and ensuring that those codes and those laws align with ILO conventions that countries have signed up to.
Thank you very much. And I think, when I was listening to your response, Anu, and I was thinking, it brings us back to some of the 5 R's, doesn't it? And to that really important framework that we're thinking about, the reward of the workers, the representation of the workers, but also the recognition, because I think that, putting women in these kind of employment positions into the labour code is about saying that this work is work and that it should be dignified and valued. So thank you so much to all of the panelists for responding to those questions. I really, really appreciate all of your inputs, and I really appreciate all of the questions from our audience. And I'm sorry that we're just running out of time now, so I'm not able to share any more of your questions, but we really appreciated your interaction. I think that the number of questions we received shows us that this was an engaging session, and that we had really a fantastic a fantastic panel today. So in closing, I would really just like to recognize our panel once again. So thank you so much to Asma, to Nadira, to Anurag, to Anu, and to Richa for all of your very rich contributions. And I would also like, just in closing, to also very much recognize the contribution of our donor and partner in the We Empower Asia program that makes this innovative work possible, and that is the European Union. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for being engaged with this very, very important and profound issue for working women and for engaging women to realize their full potential and rights in the workforce. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you, because this is work that really needs contributions from every sector and every side that's here today. So thank you so much, everybody, and I wish you a very enjoyable rest of this important forum and a good day. Bye-bye.